As societies have evolved over thousands and thousands of years, one of the key struggles has always surrounded the seemingly conflicting values of how to prioritize the well-being of the individual person or family unit on the one hand versus the well-being of the larger tribe or community on the other. Not surprisingly, if you've ever studied anthropology of religion, you know that one of the key value adds of religion to the evolution of society was the creation of a larger collective of people, tied together by presumably the same value set, and more importantly, under the same more powerful God idea. All for the purpose of creating alignments and protection for both the individual and the group. But in our world today, where the groups to which we subscribe are many, and for most of us, the ways we procure our resources of safety, shelter, and sustenance likely come from other places, we find ourselves regularly presented with the same conflict. But in this country at least, and in this modern era, we're generally oriented around the assumption that ultimately it is our needs, the needs of the self, that come first, followed by the needs of others. Altruism, though, might seem like a noble idea, but any honest analysis will call to question whether such a value is truly attainable. But nevertheless, shouldn't we strive to be that way anyway? Isn't it more noble, more Jewish even, to aspire to true selflessness? To answer that question, we need look no further than Purim, which is, if you happen to be watching this on Friday, February 26th, today, happy Purim! Now, you likely wouldn't expect Purim to offer an answer to such a philosophically complex question. After all, Purim is fun, silly, celebratory. It is not a major holiday. It's not mentioned in Torah at all. In fact, you have to go all the way to Ketuvim, the third set of books in the Hebrew Bible, to find Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther. And once there, you won't find the name of God written in the story even once. But Purim is also about things and how they aren't always what they seem. Purim's about a world turned upside down and power coming from otherwise unexpected places. So we should anticipate that despite how it presents itself to us on the surface, perhaps Purim has something greater or deeper to offer, not just in terms of its own meaning, but more importantly, how it might just provide one of the most important lessons for each of us on how we can choose to live our lives to the best of our abilities each and every day. To understand more, let's do a quick recap of the Purim story. You know it. The evil Haman, boo, has a plot to annihilate all the Jews in a single day. To pick that day, he draws lots, Purim, with a Hebrew date on each one in order to determine when the attack will take place. Now, as it happens, after banishing his previous wife Vashti, the king Achashverosh takes a new wife, the lovely Esther, who happens to be Jewish, a fact she keeps to herself. Listen, this isn't a great relationship model for marriage, but hey, it's what we have to work with. When Esther's uncle Mordecai learns of Haman's plan, he begs Esther to speak to the king, her husband, to stop Haman's decree. She agrees, risking her life by revealing her Jewish identity and Haman's evil plan to her husband, and this results in Haman's hanging and the Jews being saved. Hooray! There's a little more to the end of the story, but that's also for a different sermon. So from first glance, the lesson really appears to be that we should strive to be like Esther, selfless, self-sacrificing for the benefit of the larger collective good. But let's go back for a minute to something that's often left out in the quick summary of the Purim story. After Mordecai charges Esther to plead with the king, Esther does not immediately agree. She tells Mordecai that everyone knows that no one can go to the king uninvited, even his wife. If she shows up uninvited, she could be killed. That's a lot more personal risk than I'm willing to take on, she says. Listen, if you are asking me to write a letter or put up a post on Facebook, no problem. But risk everything for the sake of others? No thanks, I'm out, she says. So listen then to Mordecai's response, and this is what's often left out. He says, Esther, if you keep silent in this crisis, the Jews will in fact get relief and deliverance from somewhere else, but you will surely perish. Take note here of the critical and unpredictable pivot. Whereas we might have assumed that the value judgment against Esther's silence was a critique against her unwillingness to self-sacrifice for the sake of the community. Instead, Mordecai says the problem with her silence is that it, in and of itself, puts Esther in personal risk. That the one who will be sacrificed if she remains silent is no other one than Esther. The collective Jewish people will be fine. They'll find a plan B, but Esther, not so much. Now, why would that be? To understand that, you have to know that Mordecai is making a hidden reference to something else from a different story. The Hebrew phrase he uses that means to keep silent appears in a strange form, so strange that that same form appears only one other time in the entire expanse of the Bible, back in Torah to the book of Numbers, in a seemingly obscure section describing a very particular situation when one person has the power to annul the vow of another. In this section, if someone takes a vow that will cause themselves harm, and another person with the power to annul it learns about the vow, but doesn't speak up immediately, and instead only voices an objection after sleeping on it for one full day, they, the objector, are then viewed as complicit in harming the other, and they themselves take on the category of sinner. Because the person knew something was wrong, but they chose to keep silent. That same word that Mordecai says to Esther, despite the fact that they were in a position of power to stop the harm immediately. That's why Mordecai says that the Jewish people will be fine, but Esther, she won't be. What is at stake? Esther's conscience, her character, her soul. It's why immediately after Mordecai makes clear the personal danger to Esther's own well-being, that he then concludes with one of the most empowering statements in our entire Bible. Who knows, Esther? Perhaps you have attained your position for just this very moment. If keeping silent puts her at risk for essentially selling her soul, the converse is also true. Speaking up empowers her as her own individual person to be nothing less than the savior of the Jewish people. Esther hears Mordecai's message loud and clear, and when she does, she agrees to risk her life to go to the king, and in doing so, catalyzes our people's victory, changing Purim from a day of mourning to a day of rejoicing instead. But here's the cool part. The Hebrew root of the word for possessing the power to annul a vow is pei resh, the very same root as that word for lot, pei resh, Purim. So the name Purim can evoke for us not only the instrument that was intended to bring about our destruction, but more importantly, the instrument by which our people would ultimately be saved. Not altruism, but something much more attainable. The power of one person to choose agency over ambivalence, to claim their power and speak up. And that's not a message that only resonates back in the days when kings ruled the land and before countries were formed. Nor is it one that we should have to wait until a Messiah comes to truly take in. It's a value orientation that beckons loudly to each and every one of us in our world today. If I, as an individual, choose to remain silent when I otherwise have power, privilege, agency to help make a change or a difference, of course, I'm not only not helping to solve the problem, I'm not doing anyone any favors, but I'm actually endangering the condition of my own heart and my own soul. And here's why that matters. Remember the whole thing about how Purim isn't really an important holiday when compared to all the others? It's a minor one. Well, like everything else with Purim, the rabbis of the Talmud flip that on its head too. In fact, they teach that once the Messiah comes and everything is hunky-dory and perfect in existence, there will only be 2 remaining Jewish holidays. Everything else will go away. No more Rosh Hashanah, no more Pesach, no more Shabbat even. Guess what remains? Yom Kippur, which is really Yom HaKippurim, and Purim. Purim and a day like Purim. Because Yom Kippur is all about the choices we make that bring us into accountability with ourselves and our actions. A day like Purim. And ultimately, Purim itself teaches that as human beings, we have in each of our own individual lives more power, more agency, more ability to stand up for what is right, to set the world right, than we give ourselves credit for. But it's ultimately our choice whether we use that power or not. And the consequences of that choice will be nothing if not deeply personal. We are each of us accountable, and each of us as individuals matters immensely. The abnegation of the self is not a Jewish value, because if each person is created in the image of God, to negate the self would be to negate God. Why celebrate Purim after the Messiah comes? Why be Esther? Because Jewish tradition recognizes the minute one person chooses to remain silent, all the work of the Messiah is lost. God may feel elusive or hidden, but in choosing not to remain silent, in choosing to stand up for what we know is right, Judaism reminds us that each of us can indeed bring godliness into the world. Shabbat Shalom.